All right. Welcome to another episode. It's been quite a while. I neglected the podcast recently in the last months to focus more on research and teaching. These things take most of the time of an academic, of course, but I was invited to write a book chapter on enhancement technologies, especially related to brain-computer interfaces and social justice issues. So I'm revisiting some of my earlier writing on enhancement topics, um, partly to refresh my memory. What are the arguments I've made there? Is there anything I can usefully draw on for the new paper? Make sure that it's different, that I don't just make the same arguments again, but make genuinely novel points. Um, and yeah, one commentary I wrote earlier in my career, together with a large number of authors, in fact, that are in fact quite illustrious. Brian Deerp, Dira Farber, Nick Bostrom, Justin Coet, Adrian Maniino, Lucius Caviola, Anna Sandberg, Julian Savulescu. Quite surprising that I got such a bunch of authors back all together back then. It was the beginning of my PhD, and yeah, there was an opportunity to write a commentary on a Target article, um, which I thought would be a great way of connecting to some other researchers to focus on one thing that bothered me for quite a while, and that is that in the debate, enhancement technologies, yeah, we're often treated as well, either they're great and we should implement them, or this terrible thing that we should be skeptical about. Um, to simplify that at least. But there's been a bit of lack of nuance in the debate. You can't just assume that if one type of cognitive enhancement is bad, that then goes for all other forms of cognitive enhancement. And so that was essentially the idea for this short commentary. And I'll read it out now and provide some commentary along the way. For those of you who are interested in that. It's always nice sometimes to listen to papers after all. I often listen podcasts, interviews with researchers, and especially um, AI to audio apps where they upload a text and it spits it out in audio format. So if you go on a walk, you can still learn what is happening in a particular book chapter, say, which is quite nice. So title of the commentary was Recognizing the Diversity of Cognitive Enhancements. And we begin saying empirical investigations into ordinary people's bioethical intuitions have steadily grown throughout the last decades. A new study by Dean Humphreys and Chatterjee 2020 provides a paradigm example of what has recently been dubbed experimental philosophical bioethics or bioXFI. I'll skip reading out the references here just for readability. If you're interested in those, please check the actual video or the paper. Sometimes I will read the references just because it's relevant to hearing the argument, but please check it there. A descendant of both experimental philosophy, XFI, and empirical bioethics, BioXFI goes beyond merely describing people's moral attitudes and opinions. It uses experiments to actively test the factors which influence and processes which underlie the normative views of various stakeholders, with an eye to informing substantive debates in bioethics. Din and colleagues hypothesized that public opinion about the acceptability of pharmacological cognitive enhancements, which we abbreviate here as CE, would be sensitive to the experimental manipulation of framings and contexts. They found that study participants reported greater acceptance of hypothetical cognitive enhancements use among employees than students if more peers used cognitive enhancements, if the environment was less competitive, and if authority figures encouraged cognitive enhancement use. Now, What are cognitive enhancers? You can think of coffee, for instance, that's very acceptable, or drugs like modafinil, originally developed to treat narcolepsy, but it also keeps people away and might help them to focus more, help them achieve better outcomes, say, to study. Other researchers have also found that attitudes towards cognitive enhancers are susceptible to framing effects. Bergstrom and Linneo, for instance, found that such attitudes were affected by whether different forms of cognitive enhancements were described as either an herb or chemical pharmaceutical, and if the reason for use was individualistic or altruistic. Riss, Simmons, and Goodwin found that framing cognitive enhancers as reaching one's potential versus increasing one's potential boosted participant interest in cognitive enhancement. And Fritz and colleagues found that side effects were judged as more tolerable when cognitive enhancers were framed as restoring versus enhancing cognitive abilities, both within the normal range. Like Din et al., Fritz and colleagues also studied the effects of hypothetical peer pressure and indicators of the social class of potential cognitive enhancer use. Reflecting on their findings, Fritz et al. Noted, they don't quote, the history of the debate over cognitive enhancements has been one in which expert opinion has dominated and public opinion has been relegated to the backseat, if indeed a role has been considered at all. We suggest that empirical data demonstrating the public's judgment are sensitive to the reasons commonly discussed by experts provides compelling evidence that public attitudes, or even the public themselves, should be included in the development of future policy. We agree that public attitudes should be taken into account when developing future policy in this area. And the fact that there is a correspondence between certain aspects of expert judgment and public attitudes about cognitive enhancement may suggest more nuanced views among the latter than has sometimes been assumed. But how public attitudes should be incorporated remains an open question. The challenge going forward will be to develop empirically informed and normatively justified frameworks for getting from public attitudes to public policy under various conditions. What happens when ordinary people and experts disagree, for instance? Plausibly, bioXY studies could play a role in adjudicating at least some such disagreements. For example, by testing whether the intuitions of one group or the other are inappropriately responsive to normatively irrelevant factors, a so-called debunking strategy, or by otherwise helping to guide a process of reflective equilibrium between the intuitions of different stakeholders in more explicit ethical theories or principles. What the work of Din et al., Fritz et al., and others shows is that public attitudes are not monolithic. Rather, they are multifaceted and malleable. In the realm of cognitive enhancements, so-called folk intuitions are often reasons responsive and track distinctions between different kinds of cognitive enhancement use in different contexts towards different ends. We therefore strongly agree with Din et al. That policymakers will have to give up on the idea of a one-size-fits-all solution, encompassing the different diverse kinds of cognitive enhancement. Here we want to take the opportunity to further advance a more nuanced approach towards cognitive enhancement. 3 empirical lessons for the bioethics of cognitive enhancement. One problem in the literature on cognitive enhancement has been a tendency toward philosophical detachment, a common feature of much philosophical analysis throughout the 20th century, but one which is coming in for more and more criticism in recent years. E.g. Blumenthal, Barbie et al., 2020. It is a philosophical style that seeks to find general conclusions on a fairly formal level by abstracting away from the context and empirical complexity of the situation. The sort of hypothetical abstraction has similarly been criticized in ethical thought experiments, such as the trolley dilemma, which filters out such crucial factors as who is involved in a dilemma and what the relationship-specific obligations might be. At such an abstract level, participants in empirical studies that include such dilemmas may rely on general principles rather than engage in more concrete, messy moral theorizing that people use in everyday life. This likely makes such studies unrepresentative of real-world moral decision-making. But even if we wanted to take an abstract philosophical approach to cognitive enhancement as a class of interventions, this would only work if there is a general concept that covers all the different things we commonly label as cognitive enhancement, and two, this concept can be captured by armchair analysis alone. Neither of those ambitions, we think, are justified. Cognitive enhancements are too much of a disunified kind to allow general moral analysis at a level that's often employed, for example, by its critics. An analogy can be drawn with scientific modeling. Whereas young scientific disciplines tend to operate with a small number of simple, general, and fairly abstract models, mature disciplines, at least within the biological and social sciences, tend to embrace a richer model pluralism, drawing on some of my earlier research. According to this approach, a diversity of models is needed to account for the diversity of scientific phenomena at hand. Citing several papers of mine, some previously published and one forthcoming, where I explored that idea in more detail. At the time, one of my proudest ideas. But now I've published dozens of papers in scientific journals, as well as commentaries. But the model pluralism idea is still one I find quite intriguing, and in a recent short book I'm working on, I actually look at this in the context of evolutionary biology. How plurality of models is important and significant, useful for a discipline such as evolutionary biology to make progress. So the work and findings of Din et al. 2020, among other researchers, suggest that enhancement literature is reaching a stage of maturity in which we should both recognize the disunified, multifarious nature of the phenomena in question and be examined through a more pluralistic theoretical lens. Now, there is a related elephant in the room of debate around cognitive enhancement. Cognitive enhancement usually refers to functional enhancement. It refers to enhancement of memory or attention or general intelligence or some other cognitive capacity or function. These are non-normative properties, like height. It is impossible to judge whether they're good or bad without reference to normative properties or normative reasons. These reasons will be derived from values, like well-being, autonomy, justice, etc. These reasons can conflict or push in different directions, depending on the circumstances. So we can never evaluate a non-normative property like cognitive enhancement without reference to normative reasons and facts. It is a futile question to ask, is cognitive enhancement good? Or even, is enhancement of memory good? It is like asking, is it good to be tall or to be able to hear? It will depend on normative values and a precise context. In particular, we advocate realism. One of three criteria we advocate. So realism, the results of Din et al. Show a need for realistic scenarios, perhaps even derived from observational studies. No generalized statements about cognitive enhancements can be made without a recognition of their context. From the more commonly discussed cases of modafinil, Ritalin, coffee, and antidepressants, to doping in various competitive settings such as sport, to relationship affecting drugs or moral enhancers, distinctions will need to be drawn about actual substances that might be used, the ends towards which they are put, and the likely modes of delivery, and so on. 2. Individual differences. Another aspect of realism, but one which needs to be highlighted in its own right, is the range of effects enhancers can have. Not only do different substances have different typical effects, but one and the same substance can have different effects on different people depending on their individual characteristics, also depending on the dose used. Moreover, enhancement in one domain is often accompanied by impairment in another. This makes gaining coherent information from the public and assessing their opinions about cognitive enhancement in general even less logical or feasible. Context matters. In addition to individual differences, attention must be paid to both interpersonal relational context as well as wider group level social situations. These factors change the way. I lost where I was. In many cases, individuals do not work alone, but rather cooperate in dyadic pairs or groups. In the case of groups, however, group members evaluate a given enhancer. How they do so can change the performance effect it has on a group level. For example, when group members view an enhancer negatively and hence judge its user negatively, the group will be less cohesive and performance may suffer. Or if group members overestimate an enhancer's effect, they might contribute less to the joint performance, again impairing performance on the group level. So where's the bioethics of cognitive enhancement heading? It is time to give up on lines in the sand, ultimate distinctions that are forged to help us discriminate between enhancements and treatments, or morally required and morally repugnant interventions. The same substances can have different effects to different people in different conditions and different dosages, and may be used for different conscious and unconscious ends. The large class of interventions that might fall under the cognitive enhancement label is too diverse to allow sweeping generalizations. Instead, what is needed is robust, empirically informed philosophical work, with careful weighting of the conflicting moral values, trade offs, and contexts of the specific cognitive enhancements at hand. We think the proper response is to recognize that any societal policy, or indeed any ethical stance on cognitive enhancements, will have to be complex and tailored to the situation. To point to the complexity of cognitive enhancements may be unsatisfying, but is not fundamentally different from any other part of medical ethics where important principles often clash. Public and official normative views are contradictory and situation dependent, and attitudes evolve with society and technology. Recognizing this should not stop us from looking for underlying, more general patterns that are widely shared or relatively consistent across contexts. If, as Din et al. 2020 suggest, enhancers are seen as more acceptable and less competitive, more altruistic situations, then that may suggest a different set of guidelines or empirical research programs to understand why and how approaches according to which the nature of enhancers or the properties of the enhancee are the primary focus. Looking into interpersonal and situational context of cognitive enhancements use open up a range of important questions about the nature of consent, diversity of values, commitments of cultures or subcultures, and how enhancements fit into particular lived experiences. Injecting such sociological nuance into evaluations of cognitive enhancements will be less simple but more useful in elucidating what we want to be and become. So I hope you enjoyed this short commentary. I think we made a good case here. That the debate just needs to be more nuanced, and we have to be quite careful to make generalizations from one case to more. And yeah, I'll hopefully see you, in a sense, in a next episode. Enjoy your week.